Good morning. This is Gina Halstead for the transition team. And thank you, Sarah, for a most poignant and inspiring sermon today and your call to action. We at First Parish have worked hard to articulate what's important to us over the past year. And you've identified pursuing social justice and human dignity as a core value, which reflects our call to ministry submissive to affirm each person's dignity. And as Sarah said in her sermon, faith without works is dead. So our time today, our discussion is to begin thinking about, to begin considering what work we want to do, how we want to put our faith into action, and how we bring the words of affirming each person's dignity to life, how we want to make a difference. To provide meaningful discussions in the future, it seems appropriate to have a little understanding or a basis of knowledge to work upon. To answer questions like, what has First Parish done in the past? What's the focus of our affiliated denominations? What are some other churches doing? And what are our current initiatives? Joan Kimball and others have researched those questions and want to share their learnings with us today to help inform our future conversations. Sarah, may I have the agenda, please? 1 second.
Sorry, I just need to pull it up just 1 moment.
Yep, no worries, thank you. I'll go ahead and start, and while you're pulling it up. We'll start with Joan Kimball giving us a quick review of how First Parish affirmed each person's dignity in the past, how they lived out that value. She'll share the guiding principles of each of our affiliated denominations, and she'll describe the initiatives taken by some of our neighboring churches. Thank you, Sarah. Then we'll hear from representatives from Outreach, the Green Energy Committee, and the Racial Justice Advocates, who will share their initiatives and areas of focus. And after those updates, we're going to invite your questions and comments. Once we've answered all the questions and we've thought about next steps or gathered your ideas for next steps, then Jenny would like to provide space for those who would like to reflect on Sarah's sermon and the tragic events of the past week. So we ask that you stay for that as well. Thank you, and now I will pass it to Joan.
Hi, everyone. I'm Joan Kimball, and I'm a member of the Racial Justice Advocates. I'm here to give background on our work, beginning with our action-oriented forefathers and foremothers. In the beginning, those in our faith were all Puritans who, because of their strong convictions, rebelled against the Church of England and came to America. Once here, in the land that we now call Lincoln, it was not yet a town, and the residents attended Concord, Lexington, and Weston churches. But they, our spiritual ancestors, wanted their own church here in this community. After much negotiating with the General Court, which was the colonial legislature, our ancestors were able to build our first church near the site of the stone church today. And Sarah is being so lovely and gracious and going to do the slides for us. So the first slide is our original meeting house, 1746, and this was 8 years before the town was incorporated, to 1859. And the reason it says 1859 was this church burned, and the congregation built a second wooden church, and it burned down in 1891, and then the congregational community built the stone church. So if you've ever wondered why we have a stone church. For almost 100 years, our ancestors worshiped here in this church. In 1748, along with multitudes of churches north of the Mason-Dixon line, our church voted that no person who holds or traffics in slaves shall be admitted to communion. And that's quite powerful. Almost 100 years later, in 1842, a contingent based on their beliefs separated and built the Unitarian Meeting House, our current sanctuary. And this is a picture that I copied out of Reverend Charlie Styron's history of our church. And if you look closely, you could either see or imagine a horse and buggy in front of the church. 100 years later, in 1942, the two churches came together. We are both congregational, which is now called the UCC, and Unitarian, UUA. I wanted to have a picture of both churches together, which you can't do in real life. So I found Dilla Tingley's fabric art that shows our two churches together. We are a church that is based on our covenant and our call to ministry. Based on our faith and our covenant and our call to ministry, we have taken positions against what we see as injustice and for justice. During the civil rights era, as Gus recalled in his sermon last week, Charlie Styron, the Reverend Charlie Styron, and 3 parishioners marched in Selma. For Charlie Styron, the civil rights movement was the perfect example of the New Testament values in conflict with injustice. Parishioners believed this action brought the Sermon of the Mount into life. A more controversial decision was to open the church as a sanctuary for resistors to the Vietnam War. Here was another rare time for an all-church vote. There was angst. It was complex and hotly debated. And the church decided that the Prudential Committee, which I think was probably the precursor of the parish committee, would decide on a case-by-case basis to whom we'd give sanctuary. No one ever stayed here, but it was a really remarkable time. Dave Donaldson quoted his father, Don, saying, "We can disagree with each other, but we still belong to each other." And I'd like to repeat that again, because I just think we could almost have, slogans put on our hands or something. And this, of course, is Sarah Andresiak and Rob Donaldson's grandfather. We can disagree with each other, but we still belong to each other. Knowing our own church history, the racial justice advocates decided to learn about the positions of our 2 denominations on racial justice. First, Janet, and then Mary Jo will read these slides. Janet?
UCC's vision statement is united in Christ's love, a just world for all. They believe that an anti-racism is a matter of faith. Each person is created in the image of God, as said in Genesis 1:27, and therefore has intrinsic worth and value. The UCC states that when a church claims that Black Lives Matter, it is choosing to show up against all societal values of supremacy and superiority. At the 2003 General Synod, the UCC resolved that the church is called to be an anti-racist church. The UCC Ministry for Racial Justice has said that the mission of the Racial Justice Ministry is to engage every setting of the UCC to eradicate racism in our personal, interpersonal, and cultural realms.
Thank you. And Mary Jo?
The UUA has its covenant, 7 principles. These principles focus on the worth of each person, the need for justice and compassion, and the right to choose one's own belief. To better define beliefs about anti racism, UUA churches across the nation are considering adopting the eighth principle, whereby they will affirm and promote journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community, dismantling racism and other oppression in ourselves and our institutions. The UUA has many affiliates and ministries, including the UU Urban Ministry.
Thank you. Both the UCC and the UUA are providing courses for churches or curriculums for churches to follow to broaden their understanding on racism and white supremacy. The UCC has a curriculum called White Privilege, Let's Talk, Resource for Transformation Dialogue. The UUA has a curriculum based on widening the circle. Local churches of both denominations are working on these curricula in creative ways. As an ongoing project, we are reaching out to UCC and UUA churches in neighboring towns, and Lexington, Waltham, Weston, Wayland, Sudbury, Concord, and Bedford. And some of us have been attending virtual meetings with UU The Vote, UU Social Action, UU Massachusetts, Urban Ministry, and the City Mission. We've also connected with Lincoln churches, both St. Joseph, St. Julia's, and with St. Anne's. St. Joseph, St. Julia's entire Social Concerns Committee came to our showing of Good Trouble, the documentary on John Lewis. And some also have attended another of our events. One of the people that came had participated in the Great Migration, the Black migration coming north. The people in the church have been studying the experience of Black Catholics in the Catholic Church, and they're studying Pope Francis' encyclical Fratelli Tutti, We Are All Brothers, an encyclical on social justice. I was fortunate enough to attend a day-long training with St. Anne's Racial Justice Allies and their minister, Gareth Yates. They had an outside trainer from Community Change, and it was a very moving day. The Racial Justice Allies are focusing on learn, connect, and act. In their meetings, and I've been to one or two of them, they say things like, we are people of Jesus, and we're doing his work when we work on racial justice. They have signs outside of St. Anne's that say not only Black Lives Matter, but they have another sign that says, love your neighbor, no exceptions. And the sign mentions people that are discriminated against, like the homeless, immigrants, Muslims, and other groups. It's very moving. One question that comes up in churches is how to tell when an action is politics or when it is social or racial justice work. The UCC Church in West Concord has developed a statement to solve that question for them by defining politics as partisan support of particular candidates or parties. That is politics, and the rest is social justice. The First Parish Church in Lincoln, our church is one. We are a community based on our mission and covenant, and we are also individuals with different callings. We each serve our church in different ways. When there has been an overwhelming issue, such as the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, we have responded. Today, we are once again at crossroads, a time of crisis. And based on our call to ministry, our covenant, and our mission, we must consider our responses as a church, as committees, and as individuals to climate change and racial justice. We'll now hear from three of our committees, Outreach, First Parish Green, and the Racial Justice Advocates, who will tell of their work under our covenant, service to all, and call to ministry, affirm each person's dignity. And we will have the Outreach first.
Good morning. This is Doug Crosby for the Outreach Committee. And as was just noted, Uniting for the Service of All, Outreach has a number of tracks or programs that they work on annually. I'd like to start by taking a minute and talking about our special collections program that we do 3 times a year at Thanksgiving, Christmas, and Easter. Typically, we cast a wide net and we take a look locally, regionally, and even internationally at the world in places where we can, where there's a great need and where we think that we can help and make a difference. This past year, as we all know, has been a tumultuous year for everybody and everywhere, but nowhere more so in the United States with COVID and what's happened here. So this year, we've actually worked more locally than we normally have. As you may recall, this past Thanksgiving, we worked with a focus on housing, working on the Council on Aging, as the need for moderate price housing has just exploded in Lincoln. And with that special collection, collected funds, which ended up being over $10,000 to provide housing for the needy right here in Lincoln. This past Christmas, we thought as hunger became an increasing problem, we ended up working with Watch, which is a community development center that covers the region out of Waltham. And they have a program in particular that deals with people, although there are food programs that are out there with COVID, there's many people that couldn't access them, couldn't get to the food, didn't have access. And so they had a safety net, if you will, helping people that needed food to get them through this tough winter that has been for so many. Again, the community, the First Parish community raised close to $10,000 for that. And most recently, we're close to wrapping up our special Easter collection. And this is a new program that we found this year, thanks to Alice de Normandy, which is Healthcare Without Walls. They're in Boston. They focus on the health and wellness crisis facing homeless women and their children in Boston. And so it's outreach dealing with that displaced community. So this year, to date, through your generosity, we'll have in special collections donated over $25,000 to these special groups. I'd like to remind everybody that there's relatively, some programs have tight restrictions. In the special collections, we have fewer restrictions. We're looking to make a difference, and I encourage everybody in our community to let us know if they know of a situation, because we're always being mindful and looking to cast a wide net and do the best we can with the effort on an annual basis. And so with that, I'd like to turn it over to Ralph Smith, who will talk about the other programs that happen within Outreach. Ralph?
Thank you, Doug, and good morning, everyone. I wanted to start out by giving you a brief overview of the Outreach Committee. It's a group of 9 parishioners that are basically guided by a set of principles. And the principles are following our covenant, uniting for the service of all, and our call to ministry. And that's what guides us in every decision we make and every donation we make. As you are aware, Outreach is by far the largest financial factor within the parish. And I'd like to start by giving you a brief overview of what the Outreach budget consists of. To start off, we have the stewardship pledges. And out of the pledges for this past fiscal year, roughly 4% of that went to Outreach, $15,000. And it was used for organizations such as Community Day Center of Waltham, the Domestic Violence Services Unit Network, the Metro West Free Medical Center, and Open Table of Maynard. Next, we have the Williams and Bergen grants, roughly $13,000. These were gifts made to First Parish with specific guidelines dedicated for at-risk youth and youth in need. Some of the organizations that received funding this past year include the UUUM Summer Camp Program, the Lincoln Metro Coordinating Committee, and the Precious Project in Tanzania, to just name a few. By far, our largest fund source is the Gene Woods Preston Grant, which totals $75,000 in annual contributions. This was also a gift to First Parish with specific guidelines. The mission of the organization must be to provide services or advocacy consistent with the guidelines of the gift. In fiscal year 2021, we had 16 applications. 7 were followed up this year with Zoom visits. Typically, we do on-site visits to assess the organizations. And we have recommended 3 grants to the parish committee. One of which is to an organization that was recommended to us by a parishioner. And it's something we encourage every parishioner to advance organizations that they feel we should be considering for annual grants. Other organizations that have received grants in the past include the Massachusetts River Alliance, the Green Roots of Chelsea, and the Jewish Family Services of Metro West. The holiday offerings are ones, as Doug just described, that happen 3 times a year, and ones that we present to the congregation and believe are worthy of the congregation's donations. And as you have heard from Doug, the congregation was extremely generous during this past year. Sarah, could you scroll down? Besides financial donations, the Outreach Committee is also involved in a variety of service projects. Food and clothing drives with St. Joseph's for the St. Visit to Paul, most recently. Annually, we would do a Martin Luther King Service Day for the Waltham Community Center, as well as Concord Prison Outreach. And there have been various donation drives for a variety of organizations. Obviously, the ones that involve the in-person contact have been impacted for the past year due to COVID. So those are the financial and the activities of the Outreach Committee. And on behalf of the whole committee, I really want to say thank you for what I see as a very generous community, and one that I'm always proud to be a part of. So thank you.
And thank you, Outreach. This is wonderful to hear what we're doing and to hear it in a concise way. And next we will have FP Green talking about environmental justice. Steve?
Good morning, Steve Cropper here. Thank you for your time. And welcome to the Earth formerly covered with snow from yesterday. I guess it's our annual reminder that the Earth is in charge and we're not. If you're concerned about the climate change, the good news is you don't have to climb 100 feet up a tower with me. It's much simpler. So I'm going to start with a very quick pitch for opting up, and then I'll go into the core talk. The Opt Up program in Lincoln allows you to use 100% green power. We've got some very simple instructions in the bottom right there. This is the direct action part of today's presentation. Go to Mass Power Choice with your Eversource account information in hand, and you can choose 100% green. Mostly what I want to talk about today is environmental justice and job creation, because everybody has a different reason for why they care about the environment, and I want to amplify 2 of them right now. One is environmental justice. the fact that as we move towards green production of power, there are communities where we have put our dirty power plants and other facilities, and we'll be reducing our reliance on pollution in those communities. And the other one is for those of you who are concerned about the economy and job creation, is that this grows the economy, especially in New England, keeps revenue that we used to send to fossil fuel companies locally, and also shifts the balance as we create some labor or labor-intensive jobs. Next slide, please. So decarbonization, that means taking out natural gas and oil, spending less money and devoting less resources to fossil fuel production. And if we focus, as we've been doing, on electric vehicle adoption, on heat pump installation in our homes to replace fossil systems, developing wind offshore in the abundant resources off New England, and also solar, we do some job shift. And it's estimated that in this shift from those different activities, EVs, heat pumps, and so on, will create more than 10,000 jobs just in Massachusetts as we move to a low carbon grid. And your opting up is part of that effort. To bolster the opt-up message, again, you're seeding demand for renewables. In other words, by shifting your funds from fossil fuel to clean energy, you're like an investor. You're helping to seed or increase demand for solar and wind. Next slide, please. I took a look just a little while ago at all the decarbonization jobs in Massachusetts. And I looked in one site and I saw pages and pages and pages of jobs in the wind, solar, renewable, and conservation area. And since all of you are busy and probably didn't have time to do the same, just want to point them out here. They're jobs from standard project management positions to fairly detailed jobs like submarine cable technical lead, lots of internships, marketing jobs, and offshore wind electricians. So there is a huge growth in jobs. And that's even with the fact that the last 4 years have been, shall we say, unfavorable to development of our offshore resources. And we look forward to Massachusetts and New Bedford being a center for development of wind resources. Next slide, please. As I said, you can opt up easily. You don't have to follow me 100 feet up in the winter in January to a tower. Electrification of our grid and renewables mean that less funds flow out of the state to buy from oil and gas states. We're substituting in capital, we're investing, substituting in capital to replace fossil fuels, whether we're investing in efficiency in our homes, in our businesses, or renewable generation. We're also hiring tradespeople, local tradespeople who may not have had to go to college, for example, installing heat pumps, weatherizing wind and solar. And that means, again, a fuel to labor transition, which is good for our state. At the same time, the decline of our fishing sector can transition to growth in wind, as some of our ports will be sources of support for offshore wind development efforts, whether it's construction or maintenance of those. Next slide, please. A couple of weeks ago, I took my mother over to see the casino in Everett. We didn't go inside because we're good Unitarians and the notion of actually gambling was beyond us, but we did visit what's sometimes called the Everett National Sacrifice Area. It's a terrible name, but it's designed to raise awareness, because if you drive around the casino, you'll find the many, many units of the Mystic Power Plant, the liquefied natural gas terminal that takes LNG tankers and converts them to a gas for our system, and also a tank farm, an oil tank farm, that makes you think you're in Houston, Texas. This whole area is something that we in Lincoln depend upon, but we would never put up with it. And from an economic justice or maybe even a racial justice perspective, the decarbonization and the move to clean power means we're making a strong statement about this. Historically, power plants have been located in areas that didn't have the political power to object, low income and minority areas. Whether it was the power plant in South Boston, the coal plants up in Salem or in New Bedford, and we're shifting. And once again, to plug opt up, when you opt up, you're helping that transition from polluting sites to offshore wind, for example. I toured the Brayton Point coal-powered plant, and I think when I visited, it took 6 people to run the whole plant. That's not job creation. But in order to build a wind infrastructure, we're going to need jobs that do everything from pouring concrete to electrical work, all different forms of labor. And it's estimated that just electrification of heating alone, which for us substantially means heat pumps, would create over 5,000 jobs in this transition. Next slide, please. Environmental justice is not a term that is often used, but it refers to how cleaning up the environment and how moving to a clean power impacts different parts of the population. And we all know that today, good jobs may not be in low-income or minority areas, and they may not even be accessible to less educated, less resourced members of the Commonwealth. Whereas decarbonization, A, means less pollution for those low-income areas and new job creation. Energy efficiency is labor intensive. That may not seem like it's a good thing if you're the one doing it, but if you're the one being paid to do it, it's a good thing. Whether it is weatherizing our houses, whether it's installing insulation, whether it's weather stripping, whether it's heat pumps, lots of labor involved that can't be offshored, and it's not something that is centralized in a large corporation. It's decentralized among vendors that come to our homes. Jobs in trades fill gaps. And if you've ever seen the IBEW, the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers turbine in Dorchester on Route 3 going south, that's a training site that for years has been working on preparing the workforce for these kind of jobs. Many of the environmental justice impacts are akin to good factory jobs, something that we in Massachusetts have not been good at in the last few years. And on the right is a chart that shows you the income range of jobs created with our decarbonization. And you'll notice that the range is lower than the software jobs, which are the source of a lot of our headlines. Next slide, please. The Commonwealth, during our last couple of governors, really regardless of party, has been seeding the wind business. Whether it is the wind turbine test facility in Charlestown, you can see a graphic there of one of the blades, or whether it is investments in converting Brayton Point or support for offshore wind, the state has been investing for decades in seeding the wind power chain, and we're hoping that now is the time for it. By the way, in that Charlestown test facility, they torture wind turbine blades. That was built more than 10 years ago. They torture turbines, they torture the blades, and the goal is to be a test site along with the one in Boulder, where firms will come to nationally. And when they come to us for testing, they bring other resources. Next slide, please. We, of course, have taken our own efforts, whether it is solar or our efforts to promote opt-up at First Parish. And you can see the solar installation that other members of the Green Committee before my arrival deserve to be lauded for. Next slide, please. In addition to, I'll call it the labor intensive and less skilled jobs, there are hundreds of new ventures in Massachusetts that are aiming at this market, whether it's energy efficiency or other parts of the chain. The technology companies that we know and love that grow and that for many of us define our lives, there are hundreds of them in energy efficiency, solar and wind. And the faster we decarbonize, the more of those jobs come to New England as opposed to other parts of the country. Some names you may know are Schneider Electric, Enel, which has acquired some firms locally, and Veolia. We have a wealth of these firms, which are usually pretty invisible. Next slide, please. So to come back to the first initiative, you don't have to climb a tower with me. You don't have to install the solar collector yourself. You don't have to put in fiberglass insulation yourself. Go to Mass Power Choice, grab your Eversource electric bill, and you can be 100% green and make a personal statement, seeding the development of clean jobs and shifting us off renewables. So this is Steve Cropper here, and thank you for having a chance to talk to you. That's my smiling face after I got my COVID shot. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Steve. Background and lots of opportunities for us to work as individuals and perhaps as a church as we see some of those terrible environmental impacting, polluting things going into the low income neighborhoods. And now in our last presentation is Racial Justice Advocates and Mary Gaylord. Mary, you're muted.
That would help, wouldn't it? Sorry. The racial justice advocates seek to enact our calling to affirm each person's dignity, inspired by acute awareness of the devastating legacy of racism, and by the conviction that it is the responsibility of faith communities to speak to these issues with specificity and promote action that will bring about a more equitable society. We had our beginnings in a series of adult learning programs devoted to books and films focused on issues of race. In response to the events of 2020, we constituted ourselves as anti-race and anti-racist task force. And then in 2021, we've rechristened ourselves racial justice advocates, preferring this positive expression of our commitment to greater understanding, to service, and to the active pursuit of justice for all. I think we may have a slide. Okay, here we are. Our steering committee numbers 9. In addition, more than 70 First Parish and community members have signed up for our mailing list. There's always room for more on that, and have attended our events. Many more have responded to our calls for donations. I encourage you to visit our new webpage crafted by Sarah Kay. You'll find it on the First Parish website by clicking on programs, then adult programs, and then one more click takes you to racial justice advocates. That is us. Have the next slide. There you'll find 3 words that we feel summarize our mission: learn, give, and act. And I'll take you through our activities in those 3 categories. First, learning. Through the past year and a half, we have invited community members to join us in reading acclaimed works by African-American writers, most recently Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns. We have viewed 9 films, beginning with PBS's 3-part Race, the Power of an Illusion, and encompassing films devoted to voting rights, criminal justice, Indigenous experience, and psychological trauma caused by racial violence. From these, we have learned about the history of race in this country and have encouraged dialogue in and beyond the church. Most important, by listening to Black, Latinx, and Indigenous voices speaking their own truths, we have sought to acknowledge the inherent worth and dignity of each. Our webpage features links to 2 book lists, one for adults, one for children, and also a film list, each containing titles we've read or watched together, and many more, with helpful annotations and tips on accessing them. Next is Give. Our active service reinforces that of outreach, the religious exploration program, and others, with a particular focus on communities of color, which, as we know, have borne the heaviest burden during the pandemic. Racial justice advocates have been privileged to work with longstanding First Parish partners, Bay Cove Human Services Early Intervention Program, with Solutions at Work's clothing services and family support programs, and with both organizations' outreach to unhoused individuals in Cambridge. Over the past year, we have sponsored 5 drives, collecting 8 van loads of urgently needed goods. Through this material assistance, we affirm each person's value by supporting the right of every person to the essentials of a life with dignity. And then finally, there's ACT. Locally, members have participated in forums, diversity and inclusion trainings, and community conversations like the one around the film, I Am Not a Racist, Am I?, recently sponsored by Lincoln's Library and Metco programs. Joining the national outrage over the killing of George Floyd, and with broad support of the parish committee, the deacons, outreach, and many more parishioners, Racial Justice Associates arranged for the display of the Black Lives Matter banner on the church. As we hoped, it has been a catalyst for increasingly honest conversations about racial inequity in our culture. Heeding the UUA's challenge to address injustice beyond our immediate context, we organize actions that promote the dismantling of racist policies. Our members continue working with UUA and with the Center for Common Ground's nonpartisan program, Reclaim Our Vote, to encourage voter registration and voting in communities affected by voter suppression. The racial justice advocates welcome your participation, your ideas, your questions. We recognize that the work we feel called to do is not likely ever to be complete. That understanding and service, no matter how deeply rooted in faith, do not guarantee justice, and that standing up for what is right will not necessarily make it so. Yet we are spurred on not only by our individual convictions, but by the knowledge that this community stands strong with us in the quest for racial justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary, for your explanation of what the racial justice advocates are doing. It's very good. And I also, before turning it over to the transition team, want to thank Sarah Kay for her wonderful work with slides and all this technical things she does, as well as the spiritual gift she gives us. So thank you. And now to the transition team.
Good morning, everyone. As Gina mentioned, in working to capture and articulate the values of First Parish, it is not surprising that much of what the transition team heard from parishioners relates very directly to our covenant and to our call to worship, particularly with respect to our uniting for the service of all, to affirm each person's dignity, and to cherish the living earth. And as we have just heard, this congregation is not just talking about this. We are acting on our stated vision, which, to reiterate, is to be a source of hope and positive impact in our communities, our region, and beyond, by affirming the dignity of all peoples and caring for the living earth. First Parish has a legacy of taking social action in support of moral causes. We clearly have renewed energy to do so now, yet there is so much more to be done, as we say every week, if we are to be faithful to the vision of Jesus. If we are serious about helping to rid our nation of the cancer of racism, if we are to leave the earth sustainable for future generations and our grandchildren, and if we want to help those less fortunate than we, then we must act. For together, we can make a difference in the world. We are now going to break for a brief question and answer period on anything you've heard today. Please direct your questions to the particular committee for any clarification you may need. Unfortunately, we don't have time for a full discussion, but our intent is to host future conversations and small group discussions about the impact we envision and the steps we will need to take to fully achieve our vision. One quick reminder before we break: right after our brief Q&A period, Jenny will stay on to allow folks to share any thoughts and reactions you may have to Sarah's sermon today, as well as to reflect on the events of this past week. Thank you all again for participating, and a special thanks to Joan Kimball, Doug Crosby, Ralph Smith, Steve Cropper, and Mary Gaylord for your excellent presentations. Please remain muted and write your questions in the chat box or raise your hand so Gina, Chris Andresiak, and I can acknowledge you. And with this, let me bring in Gina and Chris, and we'll start with any questions you may have.
Thank you, Ken. And as Ken mentioned, if you have any questions for any of the presenters, please enter them either into the chat box. You can raise your hand as a member, as a participant, or you can wave on the screen. And between the three of us, we'll be scanning all those to try to identify you. I'm
Looks
seeing
like, Jenny Lemire has a
Lemire.
question, I think.
How are we going to help those in the states where their voting rights are being reduced? I know last year I wrote a lot of postcards. Are we going to do that same thing again for the next election? How can we assist those other than being there physically to drive them to an appropriate polling place? How are we going to help them make their vote heard? Thank you.
Ginny, I think for today's presentation, we're actually not going to try to answer that question, but rather we will capture that as an important focus for our future conversations and discussions. Thank you for bringing it up.
Katie, I think, has a question. If you want to unmute yourself, Katie, and just ask it. Katie Walker. You have to unmute yourself.
Yep, yeah, no, I was pressing the space bar, but it didn't seem to be doing anything but making spaces in the chat box. So no, I'm curious whether you, in your many conversations with other churches, whether you have gained, useful insights into what they've done that has been particularly effective or inspiring.
Yes, we have been contacting other churches, and they're all over the place depending upon where they are. For Waltham, for instance, they have a diverse community, so they're able to work directly with people who are homeless and minorities. And they have breakfast, I think, every day, and they have parishioners come as chaplains to talk with people. Other churches are working on widening the circle and educating themselves. A lot of the churches, for instance, in the UU community, are working with UU Massachusetts, and they're working on legislation, and they're working on all sorts of things to try to make the world better. They're working on prisons, they're working on just, legislation on prison reform and on immigration and all sorts of things. So there's a lot of activism in our fellow churches. The UCC churches also are doing sort of a lot of the things in educating themselves and going forward. They're doing the give thing that we are doing. And some of the UCC churches, and these initials are hard for me, UCC churches are doing an all church way to sort of look at racism and white supremacy and see how they can do better. And I've just been with the city mission group, which went on a virtual trip to Alabama, and it's been very impressive to be with the UCC ministers there. So it's all over the place, and we at some point will share what they're doing, but there are a lot of churches, and I think one of the churches, which we are going to contract, even has a sanctuary for immigrants downstairs. So there's just a whole lot of things going on.
There's a question from Jenny Morris in the chat box. I don't know if that's something we should answer now or put that also on the list for the future.
Why don't you read the question, Chris, so that everybody can at least hear it?
It said, and this is from Jenny Morris, it says, to follow on Ginny's question, is there anything we can do to bridge the partisan gaps and make our activity even more impactful that way?
Thank you, Jenny. We'll capture that.
Heather, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. So I have a question of what can we as First Parish in Lincoln do to help provide more access to COVID-19 vaccinations in our communities within the Commonwealth that are hardest hit? Is this something that it would be useful to work with UU Urban Ministries on? We're seeing such major vaccine disparities in the Commonwealth here.
Another fabulous question. Thank you. And timely. This is one that we would need to decide to take action on soon. Thank you, Heather.
And may I go back to an earlier question someone asked about legislation? I think it was Ginny. And UU the vote, UU social justice, and UU Massachusetts are all working on legislation. And there may be opportunities for us. And as Gina said, this is something that we will look at carefully in the future and make recommendations. So thank you.
Jackie writes in, we need to act now, opt up today.
Jackie wrote that into the chat for everybody.
Yeah.
But raise your hand if you're opting today.
Are there any other specific questions of any of the reports you've heard? If not, I think we should transition to a little time to share our thoughts. And Jenny, if you want to sort of pick this up.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you so much. And thank you for these wonderful, thoughtful presentations and all the, just the hours of work and thought, heart that they represent. It's really good to have it all sort of in one morning. I just thought that given another tough week in American life, as Sarah referred to her in her sermon, you know, it just sort of, our hearts, you know, they get very heavy. And as she also said, we don't have to do this alone, that we've got one another. So this is really a reflective time. It's not a solution time, but if you feel there's something on your heart you want to say regarding the especially the racism initiatives or the anti-racism or the recent killings, but it's really a time, open time for, you know, as you think about affirm the worth and dignity. It would also be a time to offer any questions, comments, or to Sarah, so sort of a sermon talk back. So that's a general invitation. And I will ask Sarah to help me with, if you would raise your hand, we'll call on you. Barbara Slater.
Well, I would just like to say how grateful I am to Sarah for intrinsically linking spirituality and action and concern about justice in the sermon this morning. It's a very important part of my heart and who I feel I am and what I feel I must be and do. And so the validation that came from your very thoughtful sermon this morning, that meant a lot to me.
Thank you, Barbara. And I see Sue Stason and then Joan.
Sue, you need to unmute.
Well, I just was so impacted by your sincerity and your anguish, Sarah. And what struck me the most was the end of the poem that the teacher had gathered the students to write. And it was, Black and brown children can change the world. if we are allowed to grow up. And it just broke my heart to hear that. I just felt such sadness and grief that that's so true. And it's to have to live with that was just very impactful and hard to hear. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. Joan, Kimball?
Yeah, I wanted to thank you so much, Sarah. It just was such an incredibly wonderful sermon. And you've been very much there to help us open our hearts. And I think in the past, I would see these things intellectually and I would think, oh, isn't that too bad? But in recent years, I've been feeling it in my heart and in my body. And, you know, sometimes when you see these things, your heart sort of changes its beat and your breathing sort of stops and you get very shallow. And I think by your giving this sermon today, you just really helped us with our grieving and with our awareness. And you are a great blessing to us. And I thank you.
Thank you, Joan. I want to lift up a comment in the chat box here, Ruth Ann Hendrickson, naming the violence against Asians in this country that has increased in recent months. Given the recent understanding of the harassment Asian people have been suffering, I would like to see us at least acknowledge the work that needs to be done there. And yes, and amen. And thank you, Ruth Ann, for centering that as well this morning.
Deanna or Edwin? One of you, someone's raising a hand. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to firstly express my appreciation for the church getting involved with the discussion and the sermon of today. Secondly, in a personal level, I'm really concerned about while it is very understandable, it is never justifiable, where the minority groups tend to have this radical feelings because of what is going on. So I can think of people from Asian group or Blacks. I have my daughter who sometimes I speak to, and I can see the anger and anguish and all that. And I just sort of seeking your prayers in addressing the possibility of radicalizing that can come from the minority groups as well. So I just wanted to throw that out there because I think it's a true concern.
Thank you, Edwin. Thank you for so much for sharing that.
Rosemary.
In addition to echoing the general reaction to the sermon, I want to thank you, Sarah, for the distinction that you raised about, or trying to help us understand the distinction about what is political and what is social justice. And, you know, I know that there can be this feeling of like, oh, we're just all the time, everything's like this. But when you link it so clearly to the text that you explored today, and how much the committees just talked about and addressed so clearly the link between our covenant and a call to action, that it's not just an abstract feel-good idea that we say these things week after week. And the call, you know, that call, and it's hard to hear, you know, even as someone who's devoted her life to this, it's hard to hear because, especially in this year of COVID, when there's, or if you have something going on in your own family, right, or your own health, it's so hard to hear that we're also still called to this when I'm still trying to like work on my taxes, or there's something going on with my kid, or I've got, something going on in the wider family. So, and the reminder then, just one last thing, and I'll stop, that we stand together, this casting this wide circle, the way the hymns all kind of, knitted us together today. It's hard, but we'll do this together. So when one of us can't do it, someone else will pick it up for a while until we can come back. That was the other part. I felt comforted and supported and honored by the way that was all woven together this morning. So
thank you, Rosemary. It is. I agree with you that it's in this sort of era of overwhelm and my feeling overwhelmed, it's comforting to know that we've got one another both for support, but also that we sort of take turns in carrying the torch. So who else would like to speak?
Jenny Morris has her hand raised.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. And this is kind of an unfinished thought, but there's something between what Sue Harmon had to say and what Sarah said that I'm trying to work out that relates, I think, to Edwin's concern, which is that a young generation feels very, very intensely. And in our maturing and going forward and kind of reaching some equanimity, we also have to find a way to make that turn into hope and hope in action. And that's about as best I can articulate it right now. But I think the two they work together, and we have to think more about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. Sue Harmon.
I think in my words, I was not speaking about action or avoiding a call to action. It was action based on a willingness not to engage on a violent level. And that was and that takes as much stillness of heart and directedness of purpose as jumping on your horse and flying off in all directions. The other thing I wanted to say was that, and this is difficult, when we say Christ taught us to do things a certain way, and that is wrapped up with our covenant, many minorities are not necessarily Christian. There are people from Africa that are not Christian. There are many, many people in the Asian community that I serve who are not Christian. I think we should think carefully about where our wisdom comes from. And when we talk about inclusiveness, just a thought, and I'm sure it will not be taken that easily, but just a thought.
Thank you, Sue. I really appreciate that, and naming the fact that there is a wide range of faith and spiritual practice in this community and in the communities that we are wanting to be in solidarity with. And so to really come back home to that universalist element, right, in the tradition of First Parish, right? For me, when I speak and the lens that I see the world, I'm speaking through a lens that is a Christian lens, but I don't want to imply that is the only lens that one can take, right? And so I think it's important that we hear one another's tradition and what are the roots in your spirituality that help you to sink down into this call to justice. Where does that come from for you? And I think that's part of what I'm hoping we can all come together and have a conversation around, right? Myself bringing my roots, and you bringing yours, and all of us sharing in that goal for working for the common good. So thank you, Sue.
Mary has her hand up. Mary Gaylord.
I know I've already had my time, but I so appreciate Sarah and Jenny, your holding us together in this moment when it just hurts to know what is going on in spheres that are distant geographically from ours, but not from our hearts. And the police killings of young Black men and boys, just so horrific. And then also the just senseless gun violence that is allowed by our passivity, I think it's so important for us to feel the hurt and to talk about the hurt, because we all know, partisan politics aside, we know that this is horrifically wrong, and we have to keep saying so. And we have to push back on the idea that this is just a partisan ploy. It is not a partisan ploy. It is every voice joining to say what is wrong and to try and translate that knowledge and that protest into action. I feel as though we take baby steps all the time, but lots of baby steps add up. Babies take baby steps and then they stride and then they run. And I think that we have to have faith in our baby steps, and in baby steps especially that put us in solidarity with communities that know about these realities on a day-to-day basis in a way that we don't. And I'm particularly moved by the work of Bay Cove and the work of Solutions at Work. Both of these organizations have stepped up in the last year to deal with homelessness and the way it has impacted already vulnerable communities, often communities of color. So I'm rambling now. Thank you, Sarah and Jenny, for being with us in the pain of this, but calling us to action out of that pain.
Thank you, Mary. I'm mindful that it's 12, so why don't we take a couple more people if you want to speak. We have time for a few more. Alice?
Yeah, I think I'm unmuted. I so appreciated all of what was presented today from start to right now. And I can't help but think about the ministerial search that we have ahead of us and how we can look at this search as an opportunity to find a leader who is going to support us and guide us and inspire us in these times. And for me I really appreciate a sermon like you gave this morning, Sarah, because it really touches my heart and where the pain is and the work that has to be done and why we come to this congregation week after week. And this community is really nurturing us. And may we find a minister that will continue to nurture and inspire us to the best of our wisdom and abilities. Thank you.
One of the resources I've turned to in the last week, actually, Alice, when you mentioned ministers, is a collection of essays by ministers of color within the Unitarian Universalist Association, and one of them is by Manish. And so I'm gonna take another. I don't have the book. I'm gonna order it, and I've read it briefly before, but I think it's a good time for me to take another look, because that's one way I learn is from listening to the experiences of my colleagues, ministers of color. So it's called Centering the Voices of Ministers of Color, something like that. It's at the UUA bookshop if you wanna take a look at that that resource. Are there any other offerings this morning?
Jenny, before we leave, could we breathe together 3 or 4 breaths just to sort of bring us together? And that's
Certainly.
just a thought.
Certainly could, Joan. Very good thought. Why don't we just take a few breaths? I've been told that the length of the exhale is particularly important, so I'm always trying to remember that. So Spirit of life, we give thanks for one another and for the way we learn from each other and especially when the ground seems to be shaking under our feet. And that's been true many, many times in the last months, and it may be true again. And so it's so good to feel the love and support and strength of a community that's been there for each other and for the wider world for generations and generations and generations. And may we continue to try to live out our covenant and our call to ministry in our day-to-day lives and in the actions we decide to take as a whole church community. Amen. Thank you all so much, and I will see you soon. Goodbye.